I'm continuing my reading of John Dewey, and going to start on a lecture that he gave in 1897, titled The Significance of the Problem of Knowledge. It will be in 3 parts. It was delivered at the University of Chicago, Contributions to Philosophy. It was delivered before the Philosophical Club of the University of Michigan in the winter of 1897, but it was reprinted with slight change from a monograph in the University of Chicago, Contributions to Philosophy. I will go over the significance of the problem of knowledge. Then I will go over his 1899 lecture, Consciousness and Experience, which was delivered at a public address before the Philosophic Union at the University of California with the title Psychology and Philosophic Method in May of 1899 and published in the University Chronicle for August of 1899. And then after that lecture, I will then read his lecture titled, I'm also going through experimental theory of knowledge as well, but the other lecture, outside of the significance of the problem of knowledge and consciousness and experiment, or consciousness and experience, as well as the experimental theory of knowledge, I will also go through his lecture concerning I'm skipping over the one on his beliefs and existences, and I'd rather go over the postulate of immediate empiricism. I'm going to go through that one as well. So not only the experimental theory of knowledge we're going through, but also experience and consciousness, as well as the significance of the problem of knowledge. So we'll go ahead and begin the significance of the problem of knowledge. It is now something over a century since Kant called upon philosophers to cease their discussion regarding the nature of the world and the principles of existence until they had arrived at some conclusion regarding the nature of the knowing process. But students of philosophy know that Kant formulated the question, quote, how knowledge is possible, end quote, rather than created it. As a matter of fact, reflective thought for 2 centuries before Kant had been principally interested in just this problem, although it had not generalized its own interest. Kant brought to consciousness the controlling motive. The discussion, both in Kant himself and his successors, often seems scholastic, lost in useless subtlety, scholastic argument, and technical distinctions. Within the last decade in particular, there have been signs of a growing weariness as to epistemology and a tendency to turn away to more fertile fields. The interest shows signs of exhaustion. Students of philosophy will recognize what I mean when I say that this growing conviction of futility and consequent distaste are associated with the outcome of the famous dictum of Kant that perception without conception is blind, while conception without perception is empty. The whole course of reflection since Kant's time of the 18th century, again, John Dewey's writing at the end of the 19th century, 1897, the inauguration year of William McKinley. The sensationalist and the rationalist have worked themselves out. Pretty much all students are convinced that we can reduce knowledge neither to a set of associated sensations, nor yet to a purely rational system of relations of thought. Knowledge is judgment, and judgment requires both the material of sense perception and an ordering, regulating principle, that of reason. So much seems certain, but we do not get any further. Sensation and thought themselves seem to stand out more rigidly opposed to each other in their own natures than ever. Why both are necessary and how 2 such opposed factors cooperate in bringing about the unified result of science becomes more and more of a mystery. It is in the continual running up against this situation which accounts for the flagging of interest and the desire to direct energy where it will have more outcome. This situation creates a condition favorable to taking stock of the question as it stands, to inquiring what this interest, prolonged for over 3 centuries, in the possibility and nature of knowledge stands for, what the conviction as to the necessity of the union of sensation and thought, together with the inability to reach conclusions regarding the nature of the union, signifies. And again, hopefully, when we read through the postulate of immediate empiricism, that'll help us get closer to knowledge. I propose then to raise this evening precisely a question. What is the meaning of the problem of knowledge? What is its meaning, not simply for reflective philosophy or in terms of epistemology itself, but what is its meaning in the historical movement of humanity and as a part of a larger and more comprehensive experience? My thesis is perhaps sufficiently indicated in the mere taking of this point of view. It implies that the abstractness of the discussion of knowledge, its remoteness from everyday experience, is one of form rather than of substance. It implies that the problem of knowledge is not a problem that has its origin, its value, or its destiny within itself. The problem is one which social life, the organized practice of mankind, has had to face. The seemingly technical and abstruse discussion of the philosophers results from the formulation and statement of the question. I suggest that the problem of the possibility of knowledge is but an aspect of the question of the relation of knowing to acting, of theory to practice. The distinctions which the philosophers raise, the oppositions which they erect, the weary treadmill which they pursue between sensation and thought, subject and object, mind and matter, are not invented ad hoc, but are simply the concise reports and condensed formula of points of view and practical conflicts, having their source in the very nature of modern life, conflicts which must be met and solved if modern life is to go on its way untroubled with clear consciousness of what it is about. As the philosopher has received his problem from the world of action, so he must return his account there for auditing and liquidation. More especially, I suggest that the tendency of all the points at issue to precipitate in the opposition of sensationalism and rationalism is due to the fact that sensation and reason stand for the two forces contending for mastery in social life, the radical and the conservative. The reason that the contest does not end, the reason for the necessity of the combination of the two in the resultant statement, is that both factors are necessary in action. One stands for stimulus, for initiative, the other for control, for direction. I cannot hope in the time at my command this evening to justify these wide and sweeping assertions regarding either the origin, the work, or the final destiny of philosophic reflection. I simply hope, by reference to some of the chief periods of the development of philosophy, to illustrate to you something of what I mean. At the outset, we take a long scope in our survey and present to ourselves the epoch when philosophy was still consciously, and not simply by implication, human, when reflective thought had not developed its own technique of method and was in no danger of being caught in its own machinery, the time of Socrates. What does the assertion of Socrates that an unexamined life is not one fit to be led by man, what does this injunction, know thyself, mean? It means that the corporate motives and guarantees of conduct are breaking down. We need to get away from the time when the individual could both regulate and justify his course of life by reference to the ideals incarnate in the habits of the community of which he is a member. The time of direct and therefore unconscious union with corporate life, finding therein stimuli, codes, and values, has departed. The development of industry and commerce, of war and politics, has brought face-to-face communities with different aims and diverse habits. The development of myth and animism into crude but genuine scientific observation and imagination has transformed the physical widening of the horizon brought about by commerce and intercourse into an intellectual and moral expansion. The old supports fail precisely at the time when they are most needed, before a widening and more complex scene of action. Where then shall the agent of action turn? The know thyself of Socrates is the reply to the practical problem which confronted Athens in his day, investigation into the true ends and worths of human life, sifting and testing all competing ends, the discovery of a method which should validate the genuine and dismiss the spurious, had henceforth to do for man what consolidated and incorporate custom had hitherto presented as a free and precious gift. With Socrates, the question is as direct and practical as the question of making one's living or of governing the state. It is indeed the same question put in its general form. It is a question that the flute player, the cobbler, and the politician must face no more and no less than the reflective philosopher. The question is addressed by Socrates to every individual and to every group with which he comes in contact. Because the question is practical, it is individual and direct. It is a question which everyone must face and answer for him or herself, just as in the Protestant scheme, every individual must face and solve for himself the question of his final destiny. Yet in the very attitude of Socrates carried with it the element of its own destruction. Socrates could only raise the question, or rather demand of every individual, that he raise it for himself. Of the answer he declared himself to be as ignorant as was anyone. The result could be only a shifting of the center of interest. If the question is so all-important, and yet the wisest of all men must confess that he only knows his own ignorance as to its answer, the inevitable point of further consideration is the discovery of a method which shall enable the question to be answered. This is the significance of Plato. The problem is the absolutely inevitable outgrowth of the Socratic position, and yet it carried with it just as inevitably the separation of philosopher from shoemaker and statesman, and the regulation of theory to a position remote for the time being from conduct. If the Socratic command, know thyself, runs against the dead wall of inability to conduct this knowledge, someone must take upon himself the discovery of how the requisite knowledge may be obtained. A new profession is born, that of the thinker. At this time, the means, the discovery of how the aims and worths of the self may be known and measured, becomes for his class an end in itself. Theory is ultimately to be applied to practice, but in the meantime the theory must be worked out as theory or else no application. This represents the peculiar equilibrium and the peculiar point of contradiction in the Platonic system. All philosophy is simply for the sake of the organization and regulation of social life, and yet the philosophers must be a class by themselves, working out their peculiar problems with their own peculiar tools. With Aristotle, the attempted balance failed. Social life is disintegrating beyond the point of hope of a successful reorganization, and thinking is becoming a fascinating pursuit for its own sake. The world of practice is now the world of compromise and of adjustment. It is relative to partial aims and finite agents. The sphere of absolute and enduring truth and value can be reached only in and through thought. The only one who acts compromises himself with the animal desire that inspires his action, and with the alien material that forms its stuff. In the two short generations, the divorce of philosophy from life, the isolation of reflective theory from practical conduct, has completed itself. So great is the irony of history that this sudden and effective outcome was the result of the attempt to make thought the instrument of action, and action the manifestation of truth reached by thinking. But this statement must not be taken too literally. It is impossible that men should really separate their ideas from their acts. If we look ahead a few centuries, we find that the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle has accomplished in an indirect and unconscious way what perhaps it could never have effected by the more immediate and practical method of Socrates. Philosophy became an organ of vision, an instrument of interpretation. It furnished the medium through which the world was seen and the course of life estimated. Philosophy died as philosophy to rise at the set and bent of the human mind. Through 1,000 and devious and roundabout channels, the thoughts of the philosophers filtered through the strata of human consciousness and conduct, through the teachings of grammarians, rhetoricians, and a variety of educational schools. They were spread in diluted form through the whole Roman Empire, and when again precipitated in the common forms of speech. Through the earnestness of the moral propaganda of the Stoics, they became the working rules of life for the more strenuous and earnest spirits. Through the speculations of the skeptics and Epicureans, they became the chief alliance and consolation of a large number of highly cultured individuals amid social turmoil and political disintegration. All these influences and many more finally summed themselves up in the two great media through which Greek philosophy finally fixed the intellectual horizon of humankind, determined the values of its perspective, and meted out the boundaries and divisions of the scene of human action. These two influences were the development of Christian theology and moral theory, and the organization of the system of Roman jurisprudence. There is perhaps no more fascinating chapter in the history of humanity than the slow and tortuous processes by which the ideas set in motion by that Athenian citizen who faced death as serenely as he convened and conversed with a friend, finally became the intellectually organizing centers of the two great movements that bridged the span between ancient civilization and modern. And as the personal and immediate force and enthusiasm of the movement, initiated by Jesus, began to grow fainter and the commanding influence of his own personality commenced to dim, the ideas of the world and of life, of God and of man, elaborated in Greek philosophy, served to transform moral enthusiasm and personal devotion to the redemption of humanity into a splendid and coherent view of the universe. A view that resisted all disintegrating influences and gathered into itself the permanent ideas and progressive ideals thus far developed in the history of humankind. We have only a faint idea of how this was accomplished or the thoroughness of the work done. We have perhaps even more inadequate conceptions of the great organizing and centralizing work done by Greek thought in the political sphere. When the military and administrative genius of Rome brought the whole world in subjection to itself, the most pressing of practical problems was to give unity of practical aim and harmony of working machinery to the vast and confused mass of local custom and tradition, religious, social, economic, and intellectual, as well as political. In this juncture, the great administrators and lawyers of Rome seized with avidity upon the results of the intellectual analysis of the social and political relations elaborated in Greek philosophy. Caring not for these results in their reflective and theoretical character, they saw in them the possible instrument of introducing order into chaos and of transforming the confused and conflicting medley of practice and opinion into a harmonious social structure. Roman law that formed the vertebral column of civilization for 1,000 years, and which articulated the outer order of life as distinctly as Christianity controlled the inner, was the outcome. Thought was once more in unity with action. Philosophy had become the instrument of conduct. That the weakness of medieval science and philosophy are connected rather with excess of practice than with excess of theory. The subordination of philosophy to theology is a subordination of science to a formulated conception of human welfare. Its essence is present, not wherever there is metaphysics, but wherever the spirit of truth is subordinated to any preconceived practical intent. And that is from his History of Aesthetics, page 146. Next, we will go into part 2 of 3 concerning the problem of knowledge, or the significance of the problem of knowledge. And then we'll also start our reading, our 3-part reading of consciousness and experience, which he talks about philosophy and psychology in 1899. And then we'll go back and we will start off with the postulate of immediate empiricism, as well as going back to our 5-part series on the experimental theory of knowledge.